It's around 6 p.m. on January 27, 2001, and Roxana Verona, a language professor at Dartmouth College, has just arrived at her friend's house in Etna, New Hampshire. Etna is a small residential area only a few miles from the Dartmouth campus, right on the edge of the New Hampshire and Vermont border. While the campus is bustling, especially during the school year, Etna is quiet. The Hartford Courant describes it as where Dartmouth goes to sleep. Roxana's friends, Hoff and Suzanne Zantop, aged 62 and 55 respectively, were also Dartmouth professors and had invited Roxana over for a fun night of dinner and just hanging out. When she arrives and finds the door unlocked, she thinks nothing of it, as her friends are expecting her and she just walks right in, calling out for them. When she enters the house, she notices it's eerily quiet, and her friends are not responding to her calls for them. She continues into the house, and that's when she spots them. Suzanne and Hoff, laying on the floor in their study, unmoving and surrounded by blood. Horrified, Roxana screams and immediately runs out the door over to the neighbor's house, where she has them call 911. When police arrive to the scene a little after 6:15 p.m., it's clear that Suzanne and Hoff Zantop have been stabbed multiple times. Police determined this not only from the couple's wounds, but from the fact that there are 2 empty knife sheaths found at the scene. The police also quickly decide that the Zantops must have known their killers, as there was no signs of forced entry. Plus the fact that the Zantop home isn't one that's easily accessible or visible from the road. According to the Hartford Courant, the Zantops lived in a 1-story home that was tucked away in a wooded area, virtually invisible to the casual passerby. With this information, and the fact that the victims had been so brutally stabbed, the police believed they had a crime of passion on their hands. But as this case unravels, we will see that it is far more twisted and terrifying than that. This is the Dartmouth Murders. Hi, strangers. This is your host, Alexa Morrissey, and today's story is one that I mentioned a few episodes back. It's a case that heavily influenced the Mount Vernon home invasion trial. While the Mount Vernon case was quickly resolved as the teenage murderers couldn't help but brag about their crimes, this case was not so easy for the police of Etna, New Hampshire, but it would result in some of the best police work I've ever come across. Lock your doors and listen closely. This is Stranger in the House. Hoff and Suzanne had both emigrated separately from Germany to the United States in the 1960s. They met at Stanford University in California, where they were both working towards their degrees. Hoff was pursuing a PhD in geology, and Susanna was getting her master's in political science. Hoff finished his PhD in 1969, and in 1970, he and Suzanne married. They had 2 daughters and eventually moved to New Hampshire to teach at the Ivy League school, Dartmouth College. The couple was beloved by Dartmouth students and faculty alike. Suzanne was described as energetic and always trying to make the most out of her life. Hoff was extremely popular amongst his students, and they said he would even take them on field trips, but still found the time to email his wife about how much he missed her when he was away. By 2001, the couple almost had 50 years of teaching experience between them, and they were finally thinking about retiring. Unfortunately, in January of that year, that choice would be taken from them. On the night of January 27th, 2001, police find Susanna and Hoff brutally murdered in their own study. They were laying in pools of their own blood, and Hoff was positioned as if he was trying to reach for Suzanne. There were no signs of forced entry, and the 2 empty knife sheaths lay discarded. Both Suzanne and Hoff had multiple knife wounds and were slashed in the throat. According to the Hartford Courant, furniture and papers were strewn about the study, suggesting a struggle. And it seemed like Hoff had defensive wounds on his left arm and leg. According to the medical examiner, whoever killed them did so between 12 and 6 p.m. that day. Police found bloody footprints from an unknown person leading from the study to the front door. Outside the front door, there were drops of blood next to the bloody footprints, which aligned in a way that suggested they had been from a person holding the murder weapon while they walked. The Zantop home was full of antiques and collectibles, but none of them were taken. All that seemed to be missing was about $350 from Hoff's wallet. This crime rocked the community, and with no witnesses, the Hanover Police Department had very little to go on. Weeks passed, and the Dartmouth students started to travel in pairs, in fear of being attacked by the murderer at large. The Hanover Police Department was composed of 3 sergeants and 13 police officers, which was normally enough to handle the Dartmouth and Etna area that rarely saw any crime of this caliber. Because of their size, the police department created the Hanover Homicide Task Force, which deputized every citizen in the area to keep a lookout. Now, unfortunately, this led to a lot of false leads. Police received hundreds of phone calls, letters, and emails from people with wild theories about the killings, but none of them were substantial. One theory that was circulating among the community was that Hoff was having an affair and his lover killed him and his wife in a crime of passion. You see, Hoff was an extremely popular professor, and many students found him very attractive. Students and faculty members were known to flirt with him. This, combined with the fact that the stabbings seemed so violent and personal, police also assumed this was a crime of passion. 3 weeks after the murders, the Boston Globe came out with an article that claimed that the murders were a result of an affair gone wrong involving Hoff. This was a theory that the police were looking into, but they had not substantiated it yet, and the Boston Globe was flooded with hate mail because of it. It turned out that the police had dismissed this theory as there was no evidence of an affair. And the Zantop's children knew their father to be faithful to his wife. 5 days after the article was published, the Boston Globe published a retraction. While there had been no witnesses to the crime, and none of the tips that had come in ended up being very helpful, the police did have some physical evidence, and they were going to do everything they could to use it to find the killer. The 2 pieces of evidence found at the crime scene were the bloody footprints and the 2 empty knife sheaths. Now, there were fingerprints on the knife sheaths, but they didn't match anyone in the police's system. Based on the sheaths themselves, police were able to determine that the knives were SOG knives, high-quality military combat knives. The SOG knife was very specifically designed for and issued to the Covert Studies and Observation Group personnel during the Vietnam War. This type of knife is unmarked and supposedly untraceable to the country of origin or the manufacturer, and this is to maintain plausible deniability of covert operators in the event of their death or capture. Eric Francis, the author of the Dartmouth murders, explains in great detail how police investigated leads to find out who had recently purchased this knife. This knife had been manufactured for several years at this point, but the good news was the sheaths that were found at the crime scene, they were relatively new. The manufacturer of the knives had only just started selling the knife with this plastic sheath in early 2000, a year before the murder. So police at least knew that these 2 knives were purchased in the last year. First, police searched for anyone who had purchased these knives from a local retailer, because that would be the easiest to find on paper. Day after day, the Hanover police officers called knife retailers and sporting goods stores all over New Hampshire, Maine, and Vermont, but came up with nothing. They started to fear that the killer could have purchased this knife secondhand, or in cash, or in some other way that would not lead back to them. Now, police had heard from a lot of the retailers that people were now buying knives online. And remember, this is 2001. The internet is still relatively new, and the officers didn't have much experience with following leads online. It was a struggle for them, and they really weren't able to find anything. But their luck was about to change, because the FBI would soon get involved. Because the case remained unsolved, Hanover called the FBI for help. With its resources, the FBI was able to go directly to the SOG knife headquarters and narrow down distributors who had sold the knives with the new sheaths. With this new list of distributors, detectives in Hanover started to make calls. They noticed that a dealer in Massachusetts called Fox Firearms had recently sold 2 identical SOG knives with the new sheaths. And they were purchased on January 1st, a little less than a month before the murders. The purchaser was Jim Parker of Chelsea, Vermont, a town only 23 miles away from where the Xantops were killed in their home. On February 15th, 2 officers, one from New Hampshire and one from Vermont, arrived at the home of Jim Parker. Or rather, they arrived at the home of John Parker. John Parker was a local home builder in the area, and he lived with his 16-year-old son, Jimmy, or Jim Parker. John invited the police in when they came to his door, and when they said they were investigating the Xantop murders, the police noticed that Jimmy, the son, was nervous right away. Jimmy Parker was a tall, skinny teenager, and when police asked him about the knives he recently purchased, he admitted that he did buy 2 SOG knives recently, but that he had bought them so that him and his friend Robert Tulloch could use them to build a fort. But unfortunately, he no longer had them. Jimmy said that he didn't remember the exact date he received them in the mail, but he and Robert opened the knives at Robert's house, and then they went into the woods a couple of times to cut branches and twigs. He said that they found the knives to be too heavy for them, so they ended up selling them. He said that either on the weekend of January 20th or the 27th, he and Robert went into town to sell the knives to a local army supply shop. Jimmy said that there was a customer in the store that ended up buying the knives directly from him when they got there, giving them $60 for each. Jimmy described the man as white, with brown hair, and a 5 o'clock shadow. Police listened to Jimmy's story, and they asked him and his father if he would be willing to go to the station to be fingerprinted, just to rule him out. With his father by his side, Jimmy goes down to the police station. While he gets fingerprinted, police visit Jimmy's friend, Robert Tulloch. When they go to Robert's house, they are greeted by the 17-year-old's parents. The officers sit down with the teenager, and Robert gives them the same story as Jimmy, except Robert says that Jimmy went into the army supply store to sell the knives by himself. As the officers are getting Robert's story, they notice that Robert has a knee injury. And when they ask him about it, he says he got it the weekend of January 27th. Coincidentally, that's the same day of the murder. He says that he slipped in the woods when he was trying to use the bathroom. After the police interview him, Robert's parents drive him to the station to get fingerprinted as well. Once the police take the prints, they then ask the teen's parents if they can check their shoes to compare them to the bloody footprints found at the floor of the crime scene. And the parents agree. The police at this point were pretty sure that these 2 boys were not responsible for the brutal murders, but they took the prints and the shoes just to be sure. After the police take the shoes from the boys' homes, both families end up back at their respective houses. In the middle of the night, Jimmy Parker's father hears his son leave the house and drive off in his car. John Parker gets up and drives around looking for his 16-year-old son, but he can't find where he went. When he gets home, instead of their son, he finds a note that reads, "Don't call the cops." Robert Tulloch was born in 1983 in North Pomfret, Vermont. His mother was a nurse and his father was a carpenter. Robert was the 3rd son of his family's 4 children, and he was born in his home rather than in a hospital. Now, I only mention this detail because this home birth seemed to give Robert a complex that he was designed for greatness because of his, quote, humble beginnings. Robert had a very intense, inflated sense of self. He considered himself an intellectual giant, and he never felt the need to put any effort into school. He was naturally charming and won the title of class president of his school's student council in Chelsea, Vermont. However, despite his landslide victory, Robert did not attend meetings, and when he did, he often appeared bored and unprepared. The other school council members actually tried to have him impeached because of this, but failed. Robert was also a member of the school debate team, but again, he was often unprepared and would resort to using insults and witty remarks against his opponents rather than facts. By his senior year, he had become very close friends with 16-year-old Jimmy Parker. While both boys were described as smart and popular by teachers and classmates alike, neither Jimmy nor Robert enjoyed school, nor had they any aspirations for college. They had belonged to a popular social circle for most of high school, but by senior year, Jimmy and Robert's relationship became slightly obsessive. They began to isolate themselves from their other friends and decided to only hang out with each other. Robert and Jimmy believed they were better than their friends and their classmates. They actually believed that they were better than everyone else in Chelsea, Vermont. They were ready to leave their unstimulating, normal lives behind, but they needed one thing to do so: money. In the summer of 2000, Jimmy and Robert decided that they wanted to move to Australia and finally get out of their small town. The problem was, they wanted to get out now, not after they saved some money from working or after they finished school. So Robert decided that in order to leave, they were going to need $10,000 to start fresh in a new country. And the only way to get that money was to steal it. Robert and Jimmy concocted a plan to get invited into someone's home and then threaten them with knives until they gave the boys their ATM card and their PIN number. The boys planned to kill whoever eventually gave them the PIN and then run off with the money to start a new life. On July 17th, 2000, Jimmy and Robert drove around Chelsea and Hanover, Vermont, looking for a house to force their way into. They kept to the Chelsea area because they had already dug a makeshift grave for their potential victim. Robert and Jimmy actually knocked on 4 different doors that night, but no one answered for them. Later that evening, they drove to Vershire, which is only about 6 minutes from Chelsea, and Robert knocked on the door of a man named Andrew Paddy, while Jimmy hid nearby. It was quite late, so Andrew Paddy answered through a small window in his front door. Robert said that he was a stranded motorist and asked if he could come in and use Andrew's phone. Not only was it an extremely late hour, but at the time, Andrew was alone with his 11-year-old son, so he declined Robert's request. Andrew actually grabbed his gun when he went to the door because he was already suspicious of this stranger knocking on his door that late at night. After his denial, Andrew said that Robert just kept asking to be let in. In fact, he asked so many times that Andrew said he had enough. He brandished his gun for Robert to see and said he was going to call the police. Andrew walked away from the front door and went to dial 911, but that's when he realized the phone line had been cut. Andrew raced back to the front door, but Robert was gone. Their failed attempt deterred Robert and Jimmy for a while, but in 2001, they upgraded their weapons to SOG knives, and they were ready to try again. In the early afternoon of January 27th, 2001, Robert and Jimmy drove to Etna, New Hampshire, and began knocking on doors randomly until someone answered. It was known that a lot of Dartmouth professors lived in the area, and the plan was for the boys to pose as students asking for help with a survey they were doing. And in an unfortunate turn of events, Suzanne and Hoff Santop eventually opened their door for these 2 boys. Hoff Santop was a very open and giving person, and he was known to allow students to drop by his house for help. When the boys stepped inside, they noticed that Suzanne was in the kitchen prepping for dinner. After she met the boys, she actually started making them lunch, and Hoff led them into his study. At first, Jimmy said that he liked the Santops and thought Hoff was actually really nice and maybe didn't need to die. But then Hoff started to ask about the survey. You see, Robert and Jimmy hadn't thought ahead enough to create an actual fake survey, and Hoff told them that they really should be more prepared. It was then that Robert seemed to take this as a personal insult. When Hoff turned away for a brief moment, Robert grabbed his knife and stabbed Hoff in the face and the chest. He continually stabbed him with such force that Robert actually missed and stabbed himself in his own knee. Suzanne allegedly heard the commotion in the study and tried to stop Robert, but that's when Robert told Jimmy to slit Suzanne's throat. Jimmy grabbed Suzanne and began to stab her as well. With both Suzanne and Hoff lying on the floor, bleeding to death, the boys walked over their bodies and grabbed $340 out of Hoff's wallet. The boys left the house and drove off far enough so that they could park on the side of the road and clean themselves up. As they cleaned their knives, they realized that they had left the sheaths back in the house. By the time they drove back to the house to retrieve them, the police had already arrived and sectioned off the crime scene. So the boys fled the area. The boys had originally planned to flee to Canada immediately after the murder, but they didn't get that far because Robert's knife wound on his knee actually started to get infected. Within a couple of days, they went back to their respective homes, and Robert had his mother, who was a nurse, look after his injury, and the two laid low for almost 6 weeks before the police visited them. On February 16th, the morning after the police had questioned Jimmy and Robert, the fingerprint analysis came back, and it was found that Robert Tulloch's prints matched those on the sheaths found at the crime scene. Police also learned that Robert had gotten his knee injury the weekend of the murders, and on the Wednesday of that week, both Robert and Jimmy were absent from school because they had made their way to Colorado and had to be flown back by their parents because the injury was infected. Both the parents and the school wrote this incident off as nothing more than senioritis, but the police saw it as two fugitives trying to flee the jurisdiction. On February 16th, the police issued a warrant for Robert Tulloch's arrest, but they soon found out that both Robert and Jimmy had fled in the middle of the night, and Robert's mother's car was missing. The police issued a warning to the community that the boys were both their prime suspects in the Zantop case, and that they were on the run. They said that they were dangerous and most likely armed. According to Eric Francis's book, people were concerned that Robert and Jimmy had access to their high school. So the morning they went missing, the police told the school to keep the teachers and the children out of the halls in case they showed up. Because Robert was 17, he was seen as an adult in the state of New Hampshire, and his warrants would be easier to issue. Late on February 16th, police issued a warrant for Robert on 2 counts of first-degree murder. He's said to be driving his mother's Audi and would probably be with a 16-year-old male. News of the warrants and the search for Robert and Jimmy reached the media that night, and by February 17th, there was a nationwide manhunt for the 2 teenagers. Robert Tulloch's mother's Audi was found abandoned at a truck stop in Sturbridge, Massachusetts, which is about 3 hours from their hometown of Chelsea, Vermont. Police interviewed several workers from a restaurant nearby, and they said that they remembered seeing the boys. They said they had backpacks on, and they were approaching truckers, asking them if they were headed west. Police figured that the boys had hitchhiked with a trucker and were on their way to the West Coast. With this information, the police decided to monitor the CBR, which stands for the Citizens Band Radio. CBR is a radio in which truckers can communicate with each other on the road. Almost a day and a half passed, when suddenly, a sergeant from the Hanover, New Hampshire police heard a promising call-in from a trucker in Indiana, almost 900 miles from New Hampshire. Over the radio, this trucker said that he had picked up 2 kids heading to California, but he couldn't take them any further west and asked if anybody else could take them. The Hanover sergeant picked up the radio and responded to this request by posing as another truck driver. He said that he could take them to California, as long as they're dropped off in Newcastle, Indiana. At 4 a.m. the next morning, local police swarmed the Flying J truck stop in Newcastle, Indiana, and the sergeant that had pretended to be the trucker on the phone arrived by helicopter. There, at the truck stop, was Robert Tulloch and Jimmy Parker, waiting to be picked up. The boys were arrested in Indiana, and then they were flown back to New Hampshire to be charged. 17-year-old Robert Tulloch was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder, and 16-year-old Jimmy Parker cut a deal to provide information and testimony against Robert in order to be charged with second-degree murder. Both were charged as adults. While the police had been searching for the two teens, they also collected a lot of physical evidence that pointed to Robert and Jimmy as the murderers. First, and most importantly, the murder weapons were found in Robert's room. Hidden away were the 2 bloody knives used to kill the Zantopps. Then, one of Robert's shoes that police had taken to analyze actually matched the bloody footprints at the scene. The fingerprints found on both the sheaths of the knives matched both Robert and Jimmy. And Jimmy's mother's car had traces of the Zantopp blood in it. Aside from all this evidence, Jimmy Parker actually gave a full confession that confirmed that they were in fact the killers in exchange for a lesser sentence. Robert Tulloch had actually planned on pleading insanity before his trial, but changed his mind at the last minute. Both boys pled guilty to the crime. And during their sentencing, Jimmy broke down and cried, while Robert remained emotionless. Jimmy Parker was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison, with the possibility of parole after 16 years. Robert Tulloch was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. According to the Dartmouth Review, one of the Zantopp's daughters read a victim impact statement at the sentencing. She said that her father's name, translated from German, meant help, and that his generosity and openness was what made the crime possible, making her parents' deaths seem like the greatest violation. Stay safe, strangers, and thanks for listening. This episode was written by Alexa Morrissey, researched by Victoria Cox, and produced by Boy Wonder Productions.